A storm was rolling in. Gray clouds loomed over the city as a young man, just 16, stood at a bus stop, his head down, lost in thought. He had big dreams but little guidance, with too many questions and nowhere to turn for answers. Life wasn't easy for him. Every day, he felt the weight of his neighborhood's reputation, the statistics people threw around, the unspoken assumptions. He was a good kid, but the world didn't always see it that way. He wanted more, but the path to more felt like a distant, untouchable place. Just then, a man stepped up to the bus stop, looking slightly out of place in his crisp, tailored suit. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with graying hair and an aura of quiet confidence. People often saw him as successful, or someone who had it all figured out. He had spent years building a life for himself, navigating his own set of struggles and triumphs. He had grown up in a different world, and in many ways, his life and the young man's couldn't have been more different. But for some reason, he noticed this kid standing there, looking like he was carrying the world on his shoulders. The man saw something familiar in the kid's eyes, a spark, an unspoken hunger, a sense of being lost but determined. He couldn't explain why, but he felt compelled to say something, maybe even help if the kid was open to it. It was rare for him to approach strangers, especially like this, but something about that moment felt right. With a slight nod, he started a conversation. At first, the young man was guarded, his face a mix of surprise and skepticism. But as they talked, his defenses began to lower, just a little. The older man spoke about his own struggles, about the times he'd felt invisible or underestimated, and about how he had managed to rise above it. There were no lectures, no judgments, just a simple offer. If the kid wanted someone to talk to, someone who understood life's rough edges, he'd be willing to help. The young man didn't commit to anything then and there. He was cautious, hesitant. It wasn't easy to trust, especially when life had taught him that people didn't always have his best interests at heart. But something about the man's tone, his sincerity, made him think. It felt different. It felt real. In the weeks that followed, their lives became intertwined in ways neither of them could have predicted. The older man offered guidance, small pieces of advice and stories from his own life. But as he did, he began to see his own past mistakes and blind spots in a new light. He'd always thought he understood what people went through, but this was different. He was seeing life through the eyes of someone who had grown up in a world he had only heard about. For the young man, these conversations were more than just advice. They were a lifeline, a glimpse into a world he hadn't imagined could be his. He was learning how to see himself differently, how to push past the limits he'd always assumed were set in stone. But with every conversation, every shared story, there was also a growing tension. They both began to realize that their worlds weren't so easily bridged. Old assumptions and hidden biases started to bubble up, small misunderstandings that hinted at deeper divides. One day, during a heated conversation, a truth came out, something raw, something neither of them was prepared for. And suddenly, their connection hung in the balance. Would they be able to overcome their differences, or would this new bond, fragile as it was, shatter under the weight of old wounds? And just like that, both were left staring at each other, unsure of the next step, each of them standing on the edge of something they couldn't yet name. This was more than mentorship now. It was a journey neither of them had planned, leading them both into unknown territory where the stakes were higher than either had realized. The young man walked away from that heated conversation, his mind racing. He'd been so grateful for the guidance, for the chance to learn from someone who seemed to have all the answers. But now he wasn't so sure. He replayed the older man's words over and over, feeling a sting he couldn't quite explain. Did the man really see him as an equal, or was he just another project? Someone the man could feel good about helping. At first, it had all seemed so simple. The older man had wanted to share his experiences, to guide him away from making mistakes he'd seen others make. The kid had soaked up every word, eager to break free from the life everyone seemed to expect him to live. But then, somewhere along the way, things got complicated. It wasn't just about mentoring anymore. As they spent more time together, the young man started noticing moments where the older man didn't seem to understand him at all. Comments that seemed harmless but felt loaded, questions that felt more like judgments than curiosity. And it wasn't intentional. He could tell that. But it made him wonder if their worlds were simply too different to ever truly understand each other. For the older man, these doubts were equally unsettling. He'd always thought of himself as open-minded, someone who treated everyone equally. He was genuinely trying to help, to give back in some small way. But in the back of his mind, he started questioning himself. Was he really listening, or was he just assuming he knew best? He caught himself, more than once, viewing the young man through a lens he hadn't fully acknowledged, a lens shaped by his own experiences and biases. One evening, after they'd exchanged a few tense messages, the older man sat alone in his study, reflecting on what had happened. He remembered a time years ago when he'd felt similarly lost and misunderstood. But was it really the same? He had grown up with resources, with networks and people willing to give him a chance. His struggle had been different, shaped by pressures of success, not survival. Now he wondered if he'd underestimated the challenges this kid faced every day. He wondered if, in trying to help, he'd unwittingly made assumptions about who the kid was and what he needed. On the other side of town, the young man was having his own reckoning. He'd been raised to keep his guard up, to stay wary of people who thought they knew what was best for him. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the older man's advice. He did, deeply. But there were things he couldn't explain, feelings he didn't know how to put into words. There was an unspoken frustration that lingered after each conversation, a feeling that no matter how hard he tried, he'd always be viewed a certain way. As the days passed, their conversations became more strained, more careful. Both felt the weight of words left unsaid. They still met, still exchanged stories, but there was a distance now, a sense of hesitation that hadn't been there before. The young man found himself holding back, saying what he thought the man wanted to hear rather than what he really felt. And the older man, though he noticed the change, wasn't sure how to bridge the growing gap between them. Then came a night that neither of them would forget. The young man was frustrated, his thoughts swirling, unable to sleep. He decided to confront the older man, to lay it all out and see if their connection could survive the truth. He typed a long message, hesitated, then deleted it, his fingers hovering over the screen. Finally, he pressed send, putting his fears and frustrations into words he'd never dared say before. He was blunt, honest, maybe even a little harsh, but he knew he had to be. If this was going to work, if there was any hope of real understanding, he had to know where he stood. When the older man read the message, his chest tightened. The words stung, but he couldn't deny the truth in them. This was what he needed to hear, even if it was hard to accept. He realized that his good intentions weren't enough, that he needed to listen in a way he hadn't before, to approach this relationship not as a mentor, but as a partner in learning. He hadn't just been offering advice. He'd been clinging to his own beliefs, his own need to be the one who knew best. And in doing so, he'd overlooked what this young man truly needed. But as he sat there, phone in hand, he didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to apologize, to make it right. But he also knew that this wasn't about quick fixes. It was about respect, about seeing each other fully, flaws and all, without trying to change or mold the other. And so, the tension hung between them, unresolved, heavy with the weight of what could be lost or gained if they both dared to confront their own fears. The journey they were on was no longer about mentorship. It was a fragile balance, one that could easily break or, just maybe, transform them both in ways they hadn't yet imagined. The silence between them grew louder. Days passed without a word, and both of them felt the absence. The young man missed the guidance, the encouragement he'd begun to rely on, but he also felt stronger somehow, more certain of who he was and what he wanted. He wasn't just looking for advice. He wanted respect, an understanding that he didn't need to be fixed. And yet, without the older man's presence, the questions in his mind seemed to grow. He wondered if he had been too harsh, if maybe he had misunderstood the man's intentions. The older man felt the silence even more acutely. Every day, he found himself replaying their conversations, wondering where he'd gone wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed, not as a mentor, but as a friend. The young man's words had pierced through his confidence. forcing him to face parts of himself he'd never questioned before. He had always thought of himself as open-minded, but now he wondered if he truly listened, if he truly seen the young man for who he was. And as the days dragged on, he began to realize that he missed the kid's perspective, the way he challenged him to see the world differently. Then, one evening, the older man made a decision. He sent a message, short and direct, asking if they could meet to talk. There was no reply at first, and he began to wonder if he'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. But just as he was beginning to give up hope, a response appeared. The young man agreed to meet, with a caution in his words that the older man hadn't seen before. It wasn't anger, it was disappointment, a sense of betrayal that went deeper than words. They met at a quiet coffee shop, a place where they could talk without distractions. The tension was thick as they sat across from each other, neither of them sure how to start. For a long time, they just looked at one another, each waiting for the other to speak. Finally, the older man took a deep breath and broke the silence. He didn't try to defend himself, didn't explain or justify. Instead, he admitted that he had been wrong, that he had seen the young man's life through his own narrow perspective. He said he hadn't meant to make assumptions, but admitted that he probably had. The young man listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the table. Part of him wanted to forgive, to believe that the older man's words were genuine, but another part of him still felt the sting of those misunderstandings, the feeling of being judged by someone who didn't truly know him. When he finally looked up, there was a calmness in his voice, a strength the older man hadn't heard before. He told the older man about his life, his dreams, his struggles, the things he'd held back in their conversations, the parts of himself he had felt were too vulnerable to share. He spoke of the challenges he faced every day, the weight of expectations, and the constant pressure to prove himself. And as he spoke, the older man listened, really listened, without interrupting or offering advice. For the first time, he was hearing the young man's story without the filter of his own experiences, without the need to fix or guide. But the more the young man spoke, the more complicated the older man's emotions became. He felt guilt, yes, but also an unshakable sense of discomfort. He had always prided himself on his understanding of the world, his ability to see people clearly, but now he was confronted with the fact that he'd been blind to so much. It wasn't just about helping the young man. It was about recognizing the ways he himself had failed to grow, to truly open his eyes to the world beyond his own experiences. As the conversation went on, the young man's words grew more pointed, each one hitting closer to the truth. He wasn't just angry about the misunderstandings. He was frustrated by the deeper, unspoken divide that had always been there. It was a divide built by years of assumptions, by a world that had taught each of them different lessons. And as they sat there, both of them began to realize that this wasn't just a conversation about mentorship. It was a confrontation with their own beliefs, their own identities, the ways they had unknowingly limited themselves and each other. The young man's voice trembled as he neared the end of his story. He wasn't just sharing his pain. He was challenging the older man to see the world through his eyes, to recognize the privilege that had shaped his understanding. And the older man, for the first time, felt a crack in his certainty, a feeling of vulnerability he hadn't expected. Just when it seemed like they might finally bridge the gap between them, a moment of tension shattered the fragile peace. The older man, without thinking, made a comment that hit a nerve. It was a simple remark, a phrase he didn't even realize carried weight, but it was enough to bring back all the doubt, all the unspoken hurt. The young man pushed his chair back, ready to walk out. He looked at the older man, his eyes a mix of anger and sadness, and said something that would echo in the older man's mind for a long time. He said, "You don't get it, do you? You want to help, but you don't want to see what it's really like." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving the older man sitting there, alone with the words that had been left unspoken, the questions that had been left unanswered. The older man felt a heaviness in his chest, a sense of loss he couldn't quite define. For the first time, he wondered if their worlds were truly too far apart, if the understanding he thought was within reach had just slipped through his fingers. He sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from him, wondering if he'd lost the chance to make things right. The questions echoed in his mind. Was he willing to see the truth? Was he willing to change, to face the parts of himself he tried so hard to ignore? And so, with the weight of that moment pressing down on him, he made a decision, a choice that would change the course of everything, one way or another. The older man left the coffee shop, his mind swirling with the young man's words. He replayed their conversation, dissecting every moment, every look, every tone, trying to figure out where things had gone so wrong. He had always thought of himself as someone who could see people clearly, someone who had an open heart and mind. But tonight he was left wondering if he'd ever truly seen this young man at all. He walked through the city streets, lost in thought, barely noticing the rain beginning to fall around him. That night he couldn't sleep. Questions haunted him, questions about his own assumptions, about the life he'd led, about the ways he'd unwittingly reinforced the very barriers he thought he was breaking. He wanted to reach out, to make things right, but he wasn't even sure where to start. And just as he began drafting an apology in his head, his phone buzzed with an unexpected message. The message was from someone he hadn't spoken to in years, a close friend from his youth, someone who'd grown up facing challenges very different from his own. They'd drifted apart over time, their lives pulling them in different directions, but this friend had once helped him see the world through new eyes. Now, in a moment that felt almost too coincidental, this friend was reaching out. The message was brief but full of warmth, inviting him to catch up, just like old times. He hesitated but decided to take the chance, hoping this meeting might give him some clarity on the crossroads he now found himself facing. When they met, his friend listened carefully as he shared the story, giving a nod every now and then, but mostly letting him talk. When he was finished, his friend leaned back, considering his words. "You're trying to help him," his friend said slowly, "but are you listening, or are you just talking?" The question hit him hard, and he felt his defenses rise. But he forced himself to stay open. His friend pointed out something he'd been afraid to admit. Maybe he'd been offering advice not out of empathy, but out of his own need to feel like a mentor, a guide. Maybe in his eagerness to give, he'd overlooked the young man's actual needs and fears. His friend's words lingered, pulling at parts of himself he'd kept hidden. He left that conversation more aware, more humbled, but still uncertain of what to do next. Meanwhile, the young man was struggling with his own thoughts. He had walked out on someone he respected, someone he'd once looked up to, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd done the right thing. Still, a part of him felt unsettled, wondering if he'd let his emotions take control, if he judged too harshly. He was beginning to see that this wasn't just about a mentor. It was about his own journey, his own search for validation and trust. And just when he thought he could put it out of his mind, his phone buzzed with a text. The message was from someone he hadn't expected, an old teacher, someone who had seen his potential years ago and had encouraged him to push past obstacles. The message was simple but pointed. Asterisk, heard you're working with a mentor. I'm proud of you for trying something new. Remember, sometimes people can surprise you. Asterisk, the timing was eerie, and he couldn't help but feel it was a sign. Maybe he needed to give the older man another chance, to see if there was more to him than he'd first thought. The two decided, separately, to reach out one last time. This time, however, they would meet on neutral ground, somewhere that didn't feel loaded with memories of their previous talks. They settled on a small park at dusk, the quiet surroundings easing some of the tension they both felt. As they stood facing each other, the older man spoke first, surprising the young man with a simple, heartfelt apology. He admitted his mistakes, his blind spots, and how much he'd come to realize because of this friendship. The young man was taken aback. He hadn't expected such vulnerability, and for a moment he felt his own defenses waver. But before he could respond, the older man said something that cut deeper than anything he'd heard before. "I want to be honest with you. This isn't just about me wanting to help you. It's about me trying to prove something to myself. I wanted to believe I could make a difference, but maybe I was doing it for the wrong reasons. I don't want to fail you, but I don't want to lie to you either." The young man felt a chill run through him. He'd always suspected there was something more behind the older man's interest, but to hear it laid bare like this was different. He was both angry and strangely relieved. It was as if, for the first time, He was truly seeing the man for who he was, flaws, uncertainties, and all. And yet, something in him softened. Maybe this wasn't about finding someone perfect, someone with all the answers. Maybe it was about learning from each other's imperfections. He could see that the older man was struggling too, that he was as much a student in this journey as he was. But just as he was about to speak, a loud commotion broke the quiet of the park. They turned, startled, as a group of people came rushing through, shouting. One of them collided with the young man, nearly knocking him over. In the confusion, the older man instinctively stepped forward, reaching out to steady him. For a split second, they locked eyes, each realizing how close they'd come to losing whatever fragile bond they'd begun to rebuild. The interruption was brief, but it left them both shaken. As the noise faded, they were left standing in silence, the tension between them higher than ever. They knew they were at a turning point, a moment where everything could either fall apart or come together in a way neither had expected. The stakes were higher now, and the choice was no longer just about words. It was about trust, about courage, and about whether they were both willing to step into the unknown, side by side. They stood there in the fading light, both still shaken from the collision, but something had shifted between them. For the first time, the young man saw not just a mentor, but a man trying to find his own way through this complicated relationship. And the older man, looking back at him, felt the weight of his own shortcomings, but also a spark of hope. This wasn't just about giving guidance anymore. It was about accepting that they were both learning from each other. In that shared moment of vulnerability, they each sensed that this conversation could be their last, or it could be the beginning of something honest and real. The young man broke the silence first, finally putting words to what he'd been holding back. He told the older man how hard it was to let down his guard, to trust someone with his fears and dreams. He admitted that he'd always expected to be misunderstood, that he'd grown up feeling like he was always fighting to be seen for who he was. The older man listened carefully, resisting the urge to respond with advice, simply absorbing the weight of the young man's words. He saw now how much he had underestimated the challenges this young man faced, not just from the world, but from the assumptions people placed on him, assumptions that even he, despite his good intentions, hadn't been able to avoid. Then the older man spoke, admitting his own fears, how, despite his age and experience, he too was still searching for purpose, for a way to make a difference. He confessed that in his eagerness to mentor, he'd been using this relationship to feel useful, to reassure himself that he was still making a positive impact. His voice shook as he admitted that maybe he'd been using the young man as a way to fill a void in his own life. He looked down, ashamed, but he knew he had to be honest. But then, the young man surprised him. Instead of reacting with anger, he gave a small nod, almost as if he understood. "I get it," he said quietly. "Sometimes it feels like we're all just trying to find where we fit." His words carried a maturity and wisdom beyond his years, a recognition that they were both just people, imperfect and searching. They shared a quiet smile, a moment of peace in the midst of all the confusion. It felt like they had reached an understanding, a place where they could move forward without the weight of past assumptions. But just as they began to settle into this newfound connection, the young man's phone buzzed. He glanced down, and his expression changed. It was a text from an old friend who had gotten himself into trouble, asking for help. The young man's face tightened as he debated what to do. The older man noticed his hesitation and asked if everything was okay. The young man hesitated, then explained the situation. A friend in need, a complicated favor that could bring trouble, but also a chance to do some good. The older man surprised himself by urging him to go to help his friend, but also offered to come along. He didn't want to overstep, but something in him felt compelled to support the young man, to stand beside him not as a mentor, but as a friend. They left the park together, heading into the unknown. The young man felt a strange sense of relief, knowing he wasn't facing this alone. And as they approached the meeting place, he realized that he had finally found something he hadn't expected, someone who would stand by him, not out of duty, but out of genuine respect and care. The older man, in turn, felt a surge of pride and protectiveness, knowing that his role here was no longer about advice, but simply being present. When they arrived, they found the friend waiting, looking tense and worried. There was an awkward moment where both men exchanged glances, each feeling out of place, but the young man stepped forward confidently. He spoke to his friend calmly, offering support without judgment, showing a side of himself that the older man hadn't seen before. The older man stood nearby, silently marveling at the strength and empathy the young man displayed. As they walked away from the encounter, the older man felt something unexpected, a sense of gratitude, not just for the chance to help, but for the young man's friendship, for the ways this experience had reshaped his own understanding of what it meant to truly connect with someone. And the young man, for his part, felt a sense of pride, not just in himself, but in the bond they had forged. They both knew that their journey was far from over, that there would be more challenges, more misunderstandings. But in that moment, walking side by side, they had crossed a threshold. The older man no longer saw himself as a mentor with answers, and the young man no longer felt he had to prove himself. They were simply two people who had learned from each other in ways they hadn't expected, forever changed by a friendship that had started with assumptions but had grown into something real. As they walked through the quiet streets, a calm settled between the two. Both felt the weight of the journey they'd shared, the lessons they'd learned together. Neither one needed to speak. The silence was no longer uncomfortable, but instead felt filled with mutual respect. They had come a long way from where they started, from a relationship built on assumptions and expectations to one grounded in genuine understanding. They stopped at a bench by the side of the road, watching as cars passed and streetlights blinked in the distance. The older man looked over at the young man, finally feeling the urge to share something he'd kept hidden for years. He spoke slowly, hesitantly at first, but soon found the words flowing. He shared a story from his past, one he'd never told anyone, a time when he had felt completely lost, grappling with failures that had left him questioning his own purpose. He admitted that his struggles had led him to try to help others, as a way to avoid facing his own uncertainties. The young man listened with quiet respect, understanding now that this man was no hero or teacher on a pedestal, but someone as flawed and uncertain as anyone else. It was strange, but the realization made him feel closer to him, like they shared a secret bond. For the first time, he could see that the older man's advice, though well-meaning, had been as much for himself as it was for anyone else. And somehow, that made him feel less alone in his own struggles. After a while, the young man shared a bit of his own story too. He talked about his frustrations, about how he'd always felt the need to prove himself, to push back against the labels the world had placed on him. He'd admitted that sometimes he felt tired, that he worried he'd never be enough, no matter how hard he tried. The older man nodded, understanding the weight of those words. They both sat in the stillness, finding an unexpected comfort in each other's honesty. In the weeks that followed, their friendship continued to grow, though it looked different from before. The older man stopped offering advice unless it was asked for, and the young man felt less guarded, more willing to share his thoughts openly. Their meetings became more about shared experiences than lessons, more about mutual respect than mentorship. They found common ground in unexpected ways: books, music, even memories from their very different upbringings. The conversations that had once felt tense and complicated now felt easy, natural, as if they were finally seeing each other without any filters. One day, the young man came to their meeting with good news. He'd landed an internship at a company he'd been eyeing for a while, a position that aligned with his dreams and gave him a real shot at building his future. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and the older man felt an overwhelming sense of joy for him. But this time he didn't say anything about how proud he was or offer any advice. Instead, he simply smiled and listened, letting the young man bask in his own success. As the young man spoke about his new opportunity, he mentioned that he'd be moving to another city soon. It was bittersweet news, but they both knew it was the right step. The older man felt a pang of sadness, but he knew their friendship wasn't ending. It was simply evolving. They'd learned from each other, helped each other grow, and now it was time to let go, to see what the next chapter of their lives would hold. There were no promises of regular calls or plans to keep meeting up, just a quiet understanding that their paths had crossed for a reason, and that whatever happened next, They'd each carry a part of this friendship with them. On the young man's last day in town, they met one final time at the same bench where they'd shared their stories. They sat in silence, both feeling the weight of their journey together. Finally, the older man spoke, his voice soft but steady. He told the young man that he had been one of the best teachers he'd ever had, that he had shown him things about the world and about himself that he might never have seen on his own. The young man smiled, his eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and sadness. He simply replied, "Thank you for listening." As they stood up to leave, they shook hands, a gesture that felt both formal and deeply personal. It wasn't just a goodbye. It was an acknowledgement of everything they'd shared, the challenges they'd faced, and the ways they'd help each other grow. Neither of them spoke as they walked away, each heading in a different direction but carrying with them a renewed sense of purpose, a sense of having made a real connection, one that didn't need constant contact to stay alive. From that day forward, they both moved into new chapters of their lives. The young man dove into his career with confidence, knowing he had someone in his corner who believed in him, even if from afar. And the older man found himself approaching his own work and relationships with a newfound humility, a willingness to listen that hadn't been there before. Their lives continued on separate paths, but every now and then, each would think back to that friendship, to the unexpected lessons they'd learned from each other. It wasn't just a memory. It was a reminder that sometimes the people who enter our lives as mentors or students become something much more profound. And as they both moved forward, they carried with them the knowledge that even the most unlikely connections can change us in ways we never see coming.